My name is Serafina. I'm 28, and I thought I knew my family until Christmas morning when my sister Vivienne threw my handmade jewelry box straight into the trash. Cheap, worthless trash, she sneered, not knowing I'd spent 3 months crafting it after losing my job. What she also didn't know was that our parents had been secretly funding her luxury lifestyle while telling me there was no money for my college loans. That moment of cruelty became the catalyst that would expose 15 years of lies and destroy the golden child facade forever. Hey everyone, before we dive into this wild family revenge story, I'd love to know, are you watching from your cozy living room, or maybe sneaking a quick video break at work? Hit that like button if you've ever dealt with a toxic family member, and don't forget to subscribe because this story has more twists than a soap opera. You're definitely going to want to stick around to see how karma served justice on a silver platter. Trust me, the ending will leave you speechless. The jewelry box incident happened 3 days before New Year's Eve. But the real bombshell dropped when I accidentally opened the wrong email on our shared family laptop. Mom had forgotten to log out of her account, and there it was. A bank transfer confirmation for $12,000 to Vivienne's account, dated just 2 weeks prior. My hands trembled as I scrolled through months of similar transactions. Since graduating college 5 years ago, Vivienne had been receiving monthly allowances ranging from $3,000 to $15,000. Meanwhile, I'd been eating ramen noodles and working double shifts at a diner just to make ends meet, constantly hearing about how tight money was whenever I asked for help with my student loans or car repairs. The emails revealed everything. Private school tuition for her kids that I thought her husband paid for. Mom and dad. Her designer wardrobe that she claimed came from her successful online boutique. Family money. The down payment on their house in the affluent Riverside district. Another generous gift from our parents, disguised as a loan that was mysteriously forgiven 6 months later. But the most devastating discovery came in an email thread between my parents and Vivienne from last summer. I remembered that time clearly because I'd called Mom crying, explaining that my landlord was threatening eviction and I needed $800 to avoid being homeless. Shed sighed deeply and told me they simply couldn't spare the money, that Dad's business was struggling and they were barely making ends meet themselves. The email chain told a different story. That same week, they'd transferred $5,000 to Vivienne for what she called a spa weekend getaway to de-stress from the kids. The correspondence was filled with concern for Vivienne's well-being, discussions about her needing self-care and how hard it must be to maintain her social status among the other wealthy mothers in her social circle. The contrast was staggering. When I needed help, I was met with lectures about financial responsibility and suggestions to maybe find a roommate or move somewhere cheaper. When Vivienne wanted money for luxuries, it was immediately available with supportive messages about how she deserved these things. I found birthday and Christmas lists where my parents discussed spending limits. For Vivienne's birthday, they'd budgeted $2,000 and debated between a designer handbag and jewelry. For mine, the budget was $50, with Mom noting that I wouldn't appreciate anything too expensive anyway since she's not really into material things. The casual cruelty of their assumptions about my preferences stung worse than the financial disparity. They'd convinced themselves that I somehow preferred struggling, that my modest lifestyle was a choice, rather than a necessity imposed by their unequal treatment. Reading further, I discovered they'd been discussing my failures and shortcomings for years. Emails dissecting why I couldn't seem to get my life together like Vivienne did. They attributed my financial struggles to poor choices and lack of ambition, completely ignoring the fact that Vivienne had received a $100,000 head start in life that had never been offered. The most infuriating thread was from 2 years ago when I'd started my own freelance graphic design business. I'd been so excited, thinking this was my chance to prove myself and achieve the financial independence they constantly lectured me about. I'd mentioned needing a better computer to handle design software, hoping for a small loan or even a birthday gift that could help my business. Instead, I found emails where they mocked my entrepreneurial efforts. Dad called it another one of Serafina's phases, and Mom worried that I was getting too big for my britches. They decided against helping because they thought failure might teach me humility and make me more realistic about my capabilities. During this same period, they'd given Vivienne $15,000 to redecorate her already beautiful living room because she felt it looked dated compared to her friends' homes. The double standard was so blatant, so systematically cruel, that I had to read through the evidence 3 times to believe it was real. They genuinely saw Vivienne as deserving of comfort and support while viewing me as someone who needed to learn life lessons through hardship. But the final straw was an email from just last month. Vivienne had complained that I seemed bitter and jealous lately, especially after she'd thrown away my Christmas gift. Instead of defending me or addressing her behavior, Mom responded with a detailed analysis of my personality flaws. She described me as increasingly resentful and suggested that my financial struggles had made me small-minded and envious of Vivian's success. Dad chimed in, agreeing that I needed to take responsibility for my choices and stop expecting handouts. This was rich, considering Vivian's entire adult life had been subsidized by handouts I never knew existed. They were planning an intervention to address my attitude problem. Mom suggested limiting my access to family events until I could adjust my perspective and be more supportive of Vivian's achievements. They discussed strategies for making me see how my negativity was affecting family harmony. Reading about their plans to gaslight me into believing I was the problem nearly broke me. They'd created this entire narrative where Vivian was the successful, deserving daughter and I was the failure who needed to be managed and contained. But as I sat there in my tiny apartment, surrounded by evidence of 15 years of systematic favoritism and emotional manipulation, something shifted inside me. The hurt was transforming into something colder, more calculating. They thought I was bitter and small-minded. They were about to discover exactly how creative and strategic their unsuccessful daughter could be when properly motivated. I spent the next 4 hours methodically screenshotting every damaging email, organizing them by date and topic, bank transfers, gift receipts, disparaging comments about my character, discussions of my failures. Everything that proved their hypocrisy was carefully documented and saved to multiple secure locations. They wanted to paint me as jealous and resentful? Fine. But they were going to learn that there's a difference between petty jealousy and justified anger. And justified anger, when properly channeled, could be absolutely devastating. The family intervention they were planning was going to happen exactly as they'd discussed. But instead of me apologizing for my attitude, they were going to face some uncomfortable truths about their own behavior. The first emotion was devastation, but by morning, something sharper had taken its place. I'd always prided myself on being the family mediator, the one who smoothed over conflicts and made excuses for everyone's behavior. But sitting there with 15 years of evidence that I'd been systematically excluded and undermined, I realized that my role as the understanding, low-maintenance daughter had actually enabled their cruelty. I called in sick to work and spent the day developing what I privately called Operation Golden Child. If my parents wanted to play favorites, I was going to expose exactly what their favoritism had cost and what kind of person they'd been supporting. My first discovery came from social media stalking. Vivian's Instagram was public, filled with photos of her lavish lifestyle, but something bothered me about the timestamps and locations. Cross-referencing with the bank transfers, I realized she'd been lying about more than just the source of her money. That successful online boutique she bragged about? The business registration had lapsed 2 years ago. The website was defunct. Yet she continued posting about work trips and business meetings that were actually shopping sprees funded by our parents. But the real goldmine was her husband, Marcus. I'd always wondered why such a seemingly decent guy stayed married to someone so openly materialistic and cruel. A deeper dive into public records revealed he'd been laid off from his engineering job 8 months ago and was drowning in credit card debt trying to maintain their lifestyle. Marcus thought Vivian's business was supporting them. He had no idea that his wife was basically unemployed, and their entire standard of living depended on handouts from her parents. The man was probably developing an ulcer from stress, while his wife got monthly manicures paid for by mom and dad. This gave me my first real weapon. Marcus deserved to know the truth, but timing would be everything. Next, I investigated their taxes. As a freelance graphic designer, I'd learned more about financial documentation than I ever wanted to know. Something nagged at me about the amounts and frequency of my parents' transfers to Vivian. My parents owned a successful accounting firm, and they were meticulous about everything except, apparently, gift tax reporting. The IRS allows annual gifts of up to $15,000 per person without tax implications. But my parents had been exceeding that limit consistently. They owed significant penalties and back taxes on unreported gifts that totaled nearly $400,000 over 5 years. That's when I realized the full scope of their fraud. They'd been writing off some of Vivian's expenses as business costs for their accounting firm, her consulting fees for social media management that she'd never actually performed, office supply purchases that were actually furniture for her house. They'd been committing tax fraud to fund her lifestyle. I felt sick but also grimly satisfied. They'd always lectured me about responsibility and integrity, while actively breaking federal law to spoil their favorite daughter. My next step was reaching out to extended family members I'd lost touch with over the years. My parents had always been controlling about family relationships, discouraging me from getting too close to aunts, uncles, and cousins. Now I understood why. My father's brother, Uncle James, responded immediately when I called. Within 10 minutes, he was sharing his own experiences with my parents' favoritism and manipulation. Apparently, the pattern went back decades. They'd borrowed money from relatives for emergencies that were actually funding Vivienne's wedding and honeymoon. They'd skipped family events when it conflicted with Vivienne's schedule, but expected everyone to accommodate my achievements or milestones. Uncle James had been quietly documenting their behavior for years, hoping someone would finally call them out. He had photos, text messages, and receipts that painted a picture of my parents as systematically manipulative and dishonest with their entire extended family. The most shocking revelation came from my cousin Diana, Uncle James' daughter. She told me about a family gathering 3 years ago, where my parents had openly discussed my problems with relatives, sharing private details about my finances and mental health struggles that I'd confided in them. They'd painted me as unstable and unreliable while positioning themselves as long-suffering parents dealing with a difficult child. Meanwhile, they'd spent that same gathering bragging about Vivienne's business success and showing off photos of her latest vacation, which I now knew they'd funded entirely. Diana had felt uncomfortable with their disparaging comments about me, but hadn't known how to intervene. She'd been wanting to reconnect with me for years, but worried that my parents had turned me against the extended family. This gave me an idea for the perfect audience for my eventual revelation. The next family reunion was scheduled for Easter, just 3 months away. My parents always used these gatherings to maintain their image as successful, generous family leaders. They'd expect me to play my usual role as the grateful, struggling daughter, while Vivienne showcased her latest achievements. But I was planning a different kind of show. I started building relationships with family members I'd been effectively isolated from, sharing carefully selected truths about my life without revealing my larger plan. I wanted them to see the contrast between the daughter they thought they knew and the one my parents had described behind my back. The response was overwhelming. Relative after relative shared stories of sensing something was off about my parents' treatment of me, but feeling unable to intervene. They'd watched me grow quieter and more withdrawn at family events, not realizing it was because I was constantly being undermined and criticized in private. My Aunt Sarah, Mom's sister, revealed that she'd offered to help me with college expenses years ago, but my parents had told her I was too proud to accept help and preferred to handle things independently. In reality, I never knew about her offer. They'd decided for me that I didn't need or deserve assistance. With each conversation, the full picture of their control and manipulation became clearer. They'd systematically isolated me from potential support systems while funneling resources to Vivienne. They'd managed my relationships and opportunities to maintain their preferred family dynamic. But their biggest mistake was underestimating exactly how much evidence they'd left behind and how motivated I could become when properly provoked. By the end of week 2, I had everything I needed: financial records, proving tax fraud, communications showing systematic favoritism, testimony from extended family about their manipulation, and a timeline that would demonstrate 15 years of deliberate psychological and financial abuse, disguised as parenting. The intervention they were planning for next month was going to be memorable, just not in the way they expected. The beauty of having been the ignored child was that nobody monitored my activities or questioned my sudden interest in family connections. While Vivienne's every move was celebrated and scrutinized, I could investigate freely without raising suspicion. My breakthrough came when I contacted Vivienne's former college roommate, Jessica, through LinkedIn. I'd always wondered why Vivienne had lost touch with most of her college friends, especially since she constantly talked about her popularity and social success during those years. Jessica's response was illuminating. She remembered Vivienne well, but not fondly. During their junior year, Vivienne had stolen Jessica's internship opportunity by lying about Jessica's qualifications to the hiring manager. She'd also spread rumors about Jessica's personal life that damaged her reputation within their sorority. But the most relevant detail was financial. Jessica remembered Vivienne constantly claiming poverty, while somehow always having money for expensive clothes and weekend trips. She'd borrowed money from friends for emergencies and never paid anyone back, always claiming her parents were too financially strained to help. Jessica put me in touch with 3 other former friends who shared similar stories. A pattern emerged of Vivienne using people, borrowing money under false pretenses, and manipulating situations to her advantage while playing the victim when confronted. This gave me crucial insight into my parents' psychology. They'd been enabling and funding Vivienne's manipulative behavior for so long that they couldn't recognize it anymore. Or perhaps they simply chose not to see it because acknowledging her true character would mean admitting their favoritism was based on illusion. My next ally came from an unexpected source. Marcus' sister Emily worked at a family law firm, and we'd met briefly at Vivienne's wedding years ago. I reached out on a pretext of needing legal advice for my freelance business, but our conversation naturally drifted toward family dynamics. Emily had been concerned about her brother for months. His personality had changed dramatically since his job loss, and had become secretive and anxious about money. Vivienne had been pressuring him to find another high-paying position immediately, while simultaneously spending money they didn't have. Emily had noticed that Vivienne's spending hadn't decreased at all despite Marcus' unemployment, which struck her as strange. Shed tried to discuss financial planning with them, but Vivienne had deflected all questions about their budget and income sources. Without revealing my full knowledge, I asked Emily hypothetical questions about financial deception in marriage, and what legal ramifications might exist for undisclosed income or gifts. Her answers confirmed my suspicions about the potential consequences Vivienne might face if Marcus learned the truth about their finances, but Emily provided another crucial piece of information. Marcus had been applying for jobs frantically, accepting positions below his skill level just to bring in income. Head sacrificed his pride and professional development because he believed he was solely responsible for supporting their lifestyle. The guilt and stress were destroying him, and Vivienne was actually becoming irritated with his negativity and lack of ambition in his job search. She had no idea that her husband was developing depression and anxiety while she criticized him for not earning enough to support the standard of living her parents were actually funding. This sealed my determination to include Marcus in my eventual revelation. He deserved to know that his wife's disappointment in his earning potential was based on a completely false understanding of their financial reality. My investigation into my parents' business practices revealed even more concerning information. Their accounting firm had several high-profile clients, and their reputation was built on promises of ethical, meticulous financial management. But their personal finances told a different story. Beyond the tax fraud related to Vivienne's gifts, they'd been playing fast and loose with business expense categories for years. Personal vacations became business conferences. Family dinners were client meetings. And Vivienne's expenses were often disguised as legitimate business costs. I created a detailed timeline showing the correlation between their lecture topics to me, about financial responsibility, and their own questionable financial decisions. Every time they'd refused to help me citing cash flow problems, they'd made significant unnecessary expenditures on Vivienne within the same month. The most damning pattern was around my major life events. When I'd graduated college, they'd claimed they couldn't afford to attend my ceremony because of travel costs, but they'd flown to Europe with Vivienne 2 weeks later. When I'd been hospitalized with pneumonia and needed help with medical bills, they'd said money was tight, then immediately afterward funded Vivienne's kitchen renovation. They'd missed or minimized every important moment in my life while prioritizing Vivienne's wants over my actual needs. But my most valuable ally turned out to be someone I'd never expected. Vivienne's neighbor, Mrs. Patterson. She was a retired social worker who'd been observing the family dynamics in their affluent neighborhood for 2 years. Mrs. Patterson had become concerned about the children, Vivienne's 8-year-old daughter Emma and 6-year-old son Tyler. She'd noticed that the kids often seemed confused and anxious about money, despite living in obvious luxury. Emma had told Mrs. Patterson that her mommy was always worried about daddy not working hard enough, but also that grandma and grandpa bought all their nice things. The child was developing anxiety about her father's adequacy and her family's security, despite living in a $500,000 house. Mrs. Patterson, with her professional background, recognized signs of emotional manipulation and mixed messages that were affecting the children's psychological development. She'd been considering reaching out to someone in the family but hadn't known who to contact. When I explained the financial deception, Mrs. Patterson immediately understood the damage being done. The children were learning that love and security were tied to material possessions, that their father was somehow failing them, and that financial dishonesty was acceptable if it maintained appearances. She agreed to document her observations and, if necessary, provide testimony about the children's well-being if custody or family court issues arose from my eventual revelations. My final preparation involved creating a comprehensive presentation. I organized the evidence chronologically, showing the progression of lies, financial fraud, and emotional manipulation over 15 years. Bank statements, tax documents, emails, and witness testimony, created an undeniable picture of systematic abuse disguised as family dynamics. I also prepared individual packets for each family member who would be present at the Easter gathering. Uncle James would receive evidence of the financial fraud. Aunt Sarah would see proof of how my parents had lied about my receptiveness to help. Marcus would get documentation of the true source of his family's income. But I saved the most comprehensive packet for Vivienne herself. Her section included not only the financial evidence but also statements from her former friends, documentation of her lies about her business, and a detailed analysis of how her behavior was affecting her children's psychological development. The beauty of my plan was its simplicity. I wasn't going to ambush anyone or create a dramatic scene. Instead, I was going to calmly present facts and let the truth speak for itself. They'd taught me to be invisible and accommodating. But they'd also inadvertently taught me to be observant, resourceful, and resilient. Those skills, combined with 15 years of documented evidence, were going to serve me well. The intervention my parents were planning would happen exactly as they'd scheduled. But instead of me apologizing for my attitude, they were going to face the consequences of their choices in front of the entire extended family. Justice wasn't going to be loud or dramatic. It was going to be thorough, methodical, and absolutely undeniable. Easter Sunday arrived with perfect spring weather, and our extended family gathered at my parents' house for their annual celebration. I arrived early, offering to help with preparations while secretly setting up my presentation materials in Dad's home office. The intervention was scheduled for after dinner, when my parents planned to address my attitude problems with the family's support. They'd briefed several relatives about my recent concerning behavior, and painted themselves as worried parents trying to help their struggling daughter. But as family members arrived, I noticed something different in their interactions with me. Uncle James, Aunt Sarah, and my cousins were warmer than they'd been in years, asking genuine questions about my life and business. The relationships I'd rebuilt over the past months had already shifted the family dynamic, though my parents hadn't noticed yet. Vivienne arrived fashionably late, wearing a designer dress that I now knew cost more than my monthly rent. She made a show of hugging everyone, while Marcus quietly helped their children settle in. I watched him carefully, noting the stress lines around his eyes, and the way he flinched when Vivienne casually mentioned their upcoming vacation to Italy. During dinner, my parents began their careful setup for the intervention. Mom mentioned how worried they'd been about my finances and attitude. Dad added concerns about my unrealistic expectations and resentment toward Vivienne's success. The family listened politely, but I could see Uncle James and Aunt Sarah exchanging meaningful glances. They were already questioning the narrative they were hearing based on our recent conversations. When dessert was served, Dad cleared his throat and announced that the family needed to address some difficult topics about supporting struggling family members. This was my cue. Actually, I said, standing up slowly, I think that's an excellent idea. I've prepared some information that might help everyone understand the family dynamics better. I distributed the evidence packets I'd prepared, watching faces change as family members opened them. Bank statements, email screenshots, tax documents, and witness testimonies painted an undeniable picture. Uncle James was the first to speak. These bank transfers. You've been giving Vivienne over $20,000 most months for 5 years. His accountant background made him immediately understand the financial implications. Mom started to deflect, but Aunt Sarah interrupted, holding up the emails where my parents had lied about my willingness to accept help. You told me she was too proud for assistance while she was literally facing eviction. The room erupted in shocked murmurs as family members processed the evidence. But I wasn't finished. Marcus, I said gently, turning to my brother-in-law who'd gone pale reading his packet. The money funding your lifestyle isn't coming from Vivienne's business. It's coming from our parents. Your wife hasn't had a real job in 2 years. Marcus stood up abruptly, his packet scattering to the floor. Is this true? He demanded, looking between Vivienne and my parents. Vivienne's face had gone white, then red. It's complicated. The business has slow periods. There is no business, I said, producing the business registration documents. It expired 2 years ago. The website is defunct. Every dollar you think she's earning is actually a gift from Mom and Dad. The silence was deafening. Marcus sat down heavily, his head in his hands. I've been killing myself trying to find work, taking jobs below my qualifications, thinking I was failing my family. Dad tried to take control. Now wait, everyone's getting worked up over normal family support. Normal. Uncle James' voice was sharp. You've given Vivienne over $400,000 in unreported gifts, while telling Serafina you couldn't spare $800 to prevent her eviction. Cousin Diana spoke up, her voice shaking with anger. And you've been telling everyone at family gatherings that she's unstable and unreliable, while knowing she's struggling because you refuse to help her. But the most damaging testimony came from Mrs. Patterson, who Id asked to arrive during dessert. As a retired social worker, her professional observations about how the financial deception was affecting the children carried significant weight. Emma told me last week that she doesn't understand why Daddy is always sad when they have such a nice house, she reported. The children are developing anxiety about financial security while living in luxury, and confusion about their father's worth as a provider. Marcus' face crumpled as he realized his emotional struggles had been witnessed and internalized by his children. My kids think I'm a failure because my wife has been lying about where our money comes from. Vivienne finally exploded. You're all being ridiculous. Parents help their children. Just because Serafina can't manage her life doesn't mean I should be punished for accepting family support. But you weren't just accepting support, I said calmly. You were actively lying about it, claiming business success you hadn't earned, and watching your husband destroy himself, trying to provide what was already being provided. I produced the tax documents Uncle James had helped me analyze. And Mom, Dad, you've been committing tax fraud to hide the extent of your gifts. The IRS penalties and back taxes you owe will likely exceed $50,000. The professional consequences hit Dad immediately. As an accountant, tax fraud could cost him his license and destroy the business he'd spent 30 years building. The most telling evidence, I continued, is in your own words. I read selected quotes from their emails, their casual cruelty about my character, their plans to manipulate me into accepting blame for their treatment, their assumption that I deserved hardship, while Vivienne deserved comfort. Aunt Sarah was crying by this point. How could you talk about your own daughter this way? How could you systematically destroy her confidence while building up the other? The room turned toward my parents, waiting for explanations that never came. Instead, they began the deflection tactics I'd expected, claiming I was vindictive, that I'd taken things out of context, that family financial matters were private. But the evidence was too comprehensive, and Id prepared the family too well. Every deflection was met with documented proof. Every excuse was countered with witness testimony. The intervention they'd planned to fix my attitude had become a reckoning with 15 years of their choices, and unlike their private manipulations, this was happening in front of people who could hold them accountable. Marcus stood up again, his voice steady but cold. Vivienne, we're leaving. Kids, get your coats. You're overreacting, Vivienne protested. This is just family drama. It doesn't change anything between us. It changes everything, Marcus replied. You've let me believe I was failing my family for 8 months, while you knew money was never really a problem. You've watched me develop depression and anxiety over finances you knew were secure. As they gathered their children, Marcus turned to my parents. Don't contact us until you're ready to discuss how this deception damaged my marriage and my relationship with my kids. The extended family began filing out, many stopping to apologize to me and express their shock at what they'd learned. The house that had been filled with celebratory noise an hour earlier was now echoing with uncomfortable silence. The weeks following Easter brought a cascade of consequences that even I hadn't fully anticipated. Within 48 hours, Marcus had moved himself and the children into his sister Emily's guest house, leaving Vivienne alone in their expensive home with no income source, except parents who were suddenly facing their own financial crisis. The IRS investigation began faster than anyone expected. Uncle James, in his moral outrage, had forwarded my evidence to a contact at the agency. Apparently, my parents' accounting firm had been flagged for review several times over the years, but the documentation Id provided gave investigators concrete evidence of systematic violations. Dad's professional license was suspended pending the investigation's outcome. His clients, upon learning about the tax fraud allegations, began terminating contracts immediately. The accounting firm that had taken 30 years to build was dissolving in real time. Mom's reaction was perhaps the most revealing. Instead of taking responsibility or showing remorse, she became obsessed with damage control and blame assignment. She called every family member who'd witnessed the Easter confrontation, alternating between tearful apologies and angry accusations that I'd destroyed the family over normal sibling rivalry. But the family members had seen too much evidence to be manipulated anymore. Aunt Sarah told me that Mom had actually tried to convince her that Id forged the bank statements and fabricated the emails. When Sarah pointed out that the financial records came from their own accounts, Mom hung up on her. The most dramatic development came from Vivienne's complete emotional breakdown. Without her parents' financial support and facing the reality of her husband's departure, she was forced to confront 15 years of lies Shed told herself about her own capabilities and worth. She'd been living in a fantasy where she was successful, admired, and deserving of luxury, while her husband was simply inadequate. The revelation that her lifestyle was entirely artificial and that her treatment of me had been witnessed and documented by multiple people shattered her self-perception completely. Emily reported that Marcus was going through his own emotional process. The relief of understanding that he hadn't been failing his family was mixed with rage at the deception and concern for his children's psychological well-being. Head started therapy to process the manipulation, and was working with a family counselor to help the kids understand why Daddy had seemed so sad and stressed. The children's reactions were particularly heartbreaking. 8-year-old Emma had been worried about money constantly, despite living in luxury, because Shed internalized her mother's complaints about her father's inadequacy. Learning that their financial security had never actually been in question while watching their father suffer had confused and upset both children. Marcus was considering full custody, not out of spite, but because Vivienne's immediate response to losing her financial support was to try manipulating the children into taking sides. Shed told Emma that Daddy was being mean, and that Aunt Serafina had lied about Mommy to hurt the family. Emily connected Marcus with a family law attorney, who specialized in cases involving financial deception. The lawyer explained that Vivienne's lies about her income could constitute fraud in their divorce proceedings, especially since Marcus had made career sacrifices based on her fabricated financial contributions. But perhaps the most satisfying consequence was completely unexpected. Jessica, Vivienne's former college roommate whom I'd contacted during my investigation, had shared my story with their old friend group. Word spread through social media about Vivienne's pattern of manipulation and financial deception. Several people came forward with their own stories of money Vivienne had borrowed and never repaid, lies Shed told about her circumstances, and relationships Shed damaged through manipulation. The picture that emerged was of someone who'd been using people her entire adult life while playing the victim when confronted. The wealthy social circle Vivienne had worked so hard to maintain began distancing themselves immediately. Apparently, financial dishonesty was particularly scandalous in their community, where people prided themselves on earned success and authentic achievement. My parents' marriage was also fracturing under the pressure. Mom blamed Dad for the tax problems, claiming Shed never understood the financial implications of their gifts to Vivienne. Dad blamed Mom for the family drama, saying her favoritism had created the situation. Both were struggling with the collapse of their social reputation. Dad's business associates were avoiding them, and Mom's social groups were buzzing with gossip about the family scandal. They'd spent decades building an image as successful, generous community leaders, and that image was disintegrating as the truth spread. The extended family had completely restructured around the new information. Uncle James and Aunt Sarah were planning a family gathering specifically excluding my parents until they took accountability for their actions. Cousins who'd been distant for years were reaching out to rebuild relationships with me. I found myself in the unexpected position of being the family member people turned to for honesty and reliability. The role reversal was dramatic. Instead of being the problematic child who needed management, I'd become the truth-teller who'd exposed years of dysfunction. But the most profound change was in my own emotional landscape. The anger that had fueled my investigation was transforming into something healthier. I wasn't carrying the weight of their disapproval anymore because their approval had been based on my willingness to accept mistreatment. My freelance design business was actually thriving, partly because several family members had started referring clients to me, but also because I was no longer sabotaging myself with the limiting beliefs my parents had instilled. Without their constant messages about my inadequacy, I was discovering capabilities I'd never recognized. The financial stress that had dominated my life was easing, not because my income had dramatically increased, but because I was no longer comparing myself to someone whose lifestyle was artificially inflated. My modest apartment and simple possessions felt adequate when I wasn't constantly reminded that I was somehow failing compared to Vivienne's false success. Most importantly, I was learning to trust my perceptions and judgments. For years, I'd second-guessed myself when family dynamics felt wrong, accepting their explanations that I was too sensitive or misinterpreting situations. Having concrete proof that my instincts had been correct all along was incredibly validating. The intervention they'd planned to fix my attitude had instead revealed that my attitude had been a healthy response to unhealthy treatment. My resentment hadn't been petty jealousy, it had been justified anger at systematic mistreatment, disguised as normal family dynamics. As winter turned to spring, and the first anniversary of the jewelry box incident approached, I realized that Vivienne throwing away my gift had been the catalyst for the best year of my life. Her moment of casual cruelty had finally pushed me past my tolerance for their treatment. Sometimes the worst thing someone can do to you becomes the best thing that ever happened to you, because it forces you to stop accepting what you should have never tolerated in the first place. 1 year later, as I sat in my new apartment, twice the size of my old place and in a neighborhood I'd always dreamed of living in, I reflected on how completely my life had transformed. The jewelry box incident that had seemed like such a small moment of cruelty had become the catalyst for the most important year of my personal growth. My design business had evolved beyond my wildest expectations. The confidence I'd gained from standing up to my family had translated into better client relationships and more ambitious projects. I was charging rates I'd never thought I deserved and consistently delivering work that reflected my actual capabilities, rather than the limitations I'd internalized from years of undermining. Several extended family members had become regular clients, but more importantly, they'd become genuine friends. Uncle James and I met for coffee every week, and had become the father figure it always needed. Aunt Sarah included me in her social circle, introducing me to women who valued authenticity over appearances. The relationship that surprised me most was with Marcus' sister Emily. Our shared experience of watching someone we loved suffer due to deception had created a strong bond. Shed helped me understand the legal aspects of emotional manipulation and financial abuse, knowledge that had been therapeutic in processing my own experience. Marcus and the kids were thriving in their new life. Head found a job that utilized his skills and paid well, but more importantly, Head rediscovered his confidence and self-worth. The children were in therapy, learning to understand that their father's previous struggles hadn't been about inadequacy, but about being manipulated by false information. Emma, now 9, had recently told Marcus that she was proud of him for being honest and working hard. The contrast with her previous anxiety about his worthiness was striking. Tyler, at 7, was simply relieved that Daddy wasn't sad anymore. Marcus had been granted full custody after Vivienne's behavior during the divorce proceedings revealed continued patterns of manipulation and dishonesty. Shed tried to use the children as leverage, promising them expensive gifts if they told the court they wanted to live with her, while simultaneously claiming poverty to avoid paying support. The irony was perfect. The woman who'd lived off family money for years was now claiming financial hardship to avoid her own financial responsibilities. Vivienne herself had moved back in with our parents, but their relationship was strained beyond repair. She blamed them for not teaching her financial independence, while they blamed her for creating the crisis that destroyed Dad's business. The house that had once showcased their perfect family image was now filled with 3 adults nursing grievances against each other. Dad had eventually pled guilty to tax fraud charges and paid substantial penalties, but avoided jail time due to his cooperation with investigators and lack of prior violations. However, his accounting license was permanently revoked, and at 62, he was struggling to rebuild a career in any related field. Mom had developed what could only be described as an obsession with family reconciliation, constantly reaching out to relatives to organize gatherings that no one attended. She couldn't understand why providing evidence of their favoritism and manipulation had damaged relationships rather than just creating temporary drama. The most telling aspect of their response was their complete inability to acknowledge the pain they'd caused me. Even facing professional, financial, and social consequences for their actions, they continued to frame the situation as my overreaction to normal family dynamics. But their inability to take responsibility had actually been liberating for me. I'd spent years hoping they would recognize my worth and treat me fairly. Learning that they were genuinely incapable of growth or change had freed me from seeking their approval. I'd started dating someone I met through a client, a teacher named David, who valued kindness, honesty, and emotional intelligence. What struck me most about healthy relationships was how easy they felt compared to the constant emotional labor I'd expended trying to manage my family's dysfunction. David had met my chosen family, Uncle James, Aunt Sarah, Emily, Marcus, and the kids, and commented on how supportive and genuine our relationships were. He was surprised when I explained that most of these connections had developed only in the past year, after I'd stopped prioritizing relationships based on biological obligation over emotional health. The family gathering we'd organized for Christmas had been everything the old family events weren't: warm, authentic, and free of underlying tension or competition. The children played freely without worry. Adults had honest conversations without hidden agendas, and everyone contributed according to their capabilities without judgment or comparison. But perhaps the most meaningful change was internal. I'd learned to trust my instincts about people and situations, instead of second-guessing myself. The years of being told I was too sensitive or misinterpreting things had taught me to doubt my own perceptions, but having my instincts validated so completely had restored my confidence in my judgment. It also learned the difference between family and relatives. Family consisted of people who supported your growth, celebrated your achievements, and showed up during difficult times. Relatives were simply people you happened to share genetics with, and that connection meant nothing without mutual respect and care. My freelance business had grown to the point where I was considering hiring an assistant, a development that would have seemed impossible during my years of financial stress and self-doubt. But more importantly, I was making decisions based on my goals and values, rather than trying to prove my worth to people who'd already decided I was inadequate. The therapy I'd started after the Easter confrontation had helped me understand how thoroughly my family's treatment had shaped my self-perception and relationships. Learning to recognize manipulation tactics and emotional abuse had been painful but necessary for preventing similar situations in the future. Most surprisingly, I'd forgiven myself for accepting their treatment for so long. Understanding the psychology of family scapegoating and financial manipulation had helped me see that my previous tolerance hadn't been weakness. It had been a normal response to systematic conditioning that started in childhood. As I prepared for the second anniversary of the jewelry box incident, I realized that Vivienne's moment of casual cruelty had been a gift in disguise. Her contempt had finally pushed me beyond my tolerance for their dysfunction and forced me to see our family dynamic clearly. The sister who'd called my handmade gift cheap, worthless trash was now living as a dependent adult in her childhood bedroom, isolated from her children and former friends, facing the consequences of a lifetime of entitlement and manipulation. Meanwhile, the daughter they'd written off as unsuccessful and bitter was building a life filled with authentic relationships, professional success, and emotional peace. Sometimes karma doesn't require your intervention. Sometimes it just requires your patience and willingness to step out of the way, while people face the natural consequences of their choices. You know what's interesting about family drama? Everyone always says blood is thicker than water, but they never mention what happens when that blood becomes toxic. Have you ever had to cut ties with family members for your own well-being, or witness someone close to you go through something similar? I'd love to hear your thoughts in the comments below. Sometimes we think we're alone in these experiences until we start sharing our stories. If this story resonated with you, or reminded you of your own family dynamics, please hit that like button, and subscribe for more real-life stories about standing up for yourself when it matters most. And definitely share this with anyone who might need to hear that they're not crazy for questioning unfair treatment from people who are supposed to love them unconditionally. Thank you so much for listening to my family revenge story, and remember, sometimes the people who underestimate you the most are the ones who end up being the most surprised by your strength. Here's to choosing the family that chooses you back, and never settling for relationships that require you to diminish yourself to make others comfortable.